signed up today. So want to welcome you into the July edition of the Meeting the Moment webinar. My name is Dan Worry. I am honored to serve, among other things, as a strategic advisor to our host for this series, the Saul Zaentz Charitable Foundation. In case maybe this is your first exposure to the foundation, it exists to extend and honor the legacy, of course, of Saul Zaentz, who had a very storied career as both a record executive and a film producer. He had three Academy Award-winning Best Pictures to his credit during his lifetime. We have a fascinating conversation in store today on the state of hardship for families, for children, and one very much in keeping with our theme of meeting the moment. We've got a fantastic panel joining us today. We are joined by Dr. Phil Fisher, who is the faculty director of the Stanford Center on Early Childhood. Summer Merrick is director of Help Me Grow of Onondaga County, New York. And Alan Cohen is the founder and CEO of the Child Poverty Action Lab, CPAL, in Dallas, Texas. So great to have all of you with us. Want to flag for those of you who are watching that later in the hour, as usual, we will open the conversation up and throw the panel some of your questions. And so if you've got a question throughout the hour that you'd like us to pose, if you would, we'd ask that you use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can see already how quickly the chat moves. Feel free to keep using the chat to react throughout the hour and to have conversation with one another. But it will definitely help us to make sure that your question isn't lost in the shuffle if you can use that Q&A function rather than the chat if you have a specific question for the panel. The other housekeeping bit that I wanted to mention to you is that registration is now open for our August edition of Meeting the Moment. We will be talking about the promise and the peril of AI in education. We'll be talking with Carrie James of Harvard's Project Zero, Dr. Dana Suskind from the University of Chicago, and others. That session will be held on August 15th, and we will drop that registration link into the chat here in just a couple moments, and then periodically, maybe throughout the hour. So as you see that registration link pop up, do feel free to open up another window and get yourself registered. We would love to see you on Friday, August the 15th, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern. We found that that's a great time that we can hit all of the time zones here across the U.S., but also get into Europe at a reasonable hour. And so, looking forward to that. I think that'll be another can't miss sort of conversation. So why don't we jump into our question around the state of hardship for children and families. And Phil, want to start with you. You know that our theme for this series is meeting the moment, and you and your team have really sort of been embracing that very concept over the past 5 years in the form of the Rapid Early Childhood, or Rapid EC survey that you lead, which started as an effort, I know, to track the needs of families in another very unique moment in time. So wondered if you might kick us off today by maybe providing a little background on the survey's origins and purpose and reach, and then maybe share a little bit of an overview as to what the data currently is telling us about how families are faring in this moment.
Sure, Dan. Thanks very much for hosting, and thanks to the Saul Zaentz Charitable Foundation for supporting this webinar series. And thanks to everybody for joining, including our presenters this morning. So, as you mentioned, the Rapid Survey was initiated in the spring of 2020, right at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And our goal was really to be able to provide a kind of a living document witness of what people would be living through in the context of the pandemic, in particular, families and households with young children. Um, We never imagined when we got started that we would 5 years plus later still be in a position where it was extremely important to document and bear witness to these experiences. But as time has unfolded, it's become clear that really this is an ongoing need, not only to make sure that households with young kids and others in the lives of young children really feel listened to and heard, but also to furnish actionable data to policymakers, to advocates, and to others. Um, the original survey was designed around really understanding the domains that are really critical for children and families to thrive. And so we asked about the extent to which people had adequate health care, had adequate access to and use of childcare. We also asked a question about people's ability to pay for basic needs, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we asked about both parent levels of distress in a variety of areas, anxiety, depression, stress, and loneliness. And we asked about children's distress as well, in terms of the extent to which they seemed worried and anxious, as well as the extent to which they seemed more fussy and kind of acting out. Um, the survey is done on a national basis. So every time the survey goes out, and it's done monthly now, we get about 1,000 participants that are as close as possible to representative of the US population from across all 50 states. And we also run a parallel survey of the early care and education workforce that's been going on since 2021. But let me zero in on the issues around uh, material hardship. So this is a concept that has been used in family-based research and economic research for some time as an alternative to just looking at income. The challenge with income is that just looking at the amount of money that people bring in doesn't necessarily account for what the cost of living is or what families' overall expenses might be. And so the idea with hardship, material hardship, is that it captures much more the extent to which people are struggling to make ends meet. And so when we ask about hardship, we ask about whether people are able in the last month to pay for the costs of the following items: food, utilities, rent or mortgage, childcare, healthcare, and other kind of critical expenses. And you can think about this as kind of a running record of the extent to which families with young kids and the early care and education workforce really have what they need in order to support the most basic needs of their families. Um, so let me just show you a couple of slides, and then I know I'm very anxious to hear from our other presenters, but I think this will at least help to sort of frame up some of what we'll be talking about. All right. Um, So what you can see here is a graph that shows since the very beginning in April of 2020, the proportion of households that report in any given month that they couldn't pay for these basic needs that you see on the right-hand side in a given month. And what you can see is that that amount has really fluctuated a fair amount. You can see that it sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, it was between 30 and 40%. Most people will notice that it took a dip in the spring of 2021. That's when the child tax credit and a number of other pandemic-related family relief policies were in place. Once those went away, combined with increasing consumer prices, you see that the numbers have hovered around 40%. We are particularly concerned because in the last month that we have data for, June, we saw that number for the first time jump above 50%. So more than half of households, and again, this is a very diverse sample that includes both low, medium, and middle and upper income families. In that representative or very diverse sample, what we see is more than half of families are saying they can't pay for basic needs. And I'm sure people have seen things about the costs of food, but also the astronomical costs of childcare and how it takes such a bite out of people's overall income. And you can see this reflected in what's happening here. We do not know specifically why there's been this big jump in the last month. It's something that we're now working on trying to understand and identify. But just to see these rates, even at 40% in a country that's as affluent as the US, is quite concerning. And we see a very similar picture with the early care and education workforce. We started that survey a little bit later, but you can see the dip in April of 2021 rather. But more concerning, in the last several months, we see rates of hardship in the 60 and above percent range among those who were expecting and relying upon to provide supportive, responsive, and high quality care to our youngest children. And the last thing I want to say about this is that we've consistently documented in our data that when adults in the lives of young children don't have sufficient money to make ends meet, that this leads to what we've called a chain reaction of hardship, where in subsequent months, adults will report that they're then experiencing higher levels of distress. And then when we follow the families further out in time, we see that they're reporting that their children have become more distressed. So, for people who are concerned about the well being of children, children thriving in the midst of some of the challenges that this country is facing, the idea that economic issues and material hardship play a key role in whether children are thriving or not is something that we are really motivated to draw attention to.
So thank you. I mean that those slides are so compelling. I mean, I think the family slide, the first one, um, fascinating to see. And I guess I would invite the audience maybe to weigh in the chat as well. To see that spike in the past 2 months is really dramatic and maybe sort of a canary in the coal mine maybe for what's to come. I don't know if that's related to inflation or what exactly is causing that. But we'll be really interested as as you and your team continue to sort of track that to continue to get a read on what has happened here that it has spiked in that way. And then to me the other the early childhood workforce piece is such a fascinating one as well. I know Alan, you're tracking this in Dallas as well, but the our early childhood workforce is diverse, but certainly those who are working in what we consider childcare settings, not surprising to see a high level of hardships there. The current national median pay for infant toddler teachers is somewhere in the range of $13.22 an hour, which is roughly 60 cents an hour less than we pay dog walkers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so, one of the most poorly compensated professions, certainly all out of whack in terms of the critical role that those individuals are playing as brain builders for our young children. But to see their reported levels of hardship ticking upward alongside families is definitely concerning. So, Alan, let's turn to you on that point. I know as the CEO of the Child Poverty Action Lab in Dallas, you are using the rapid survey as one of I know multiple sources of data to help to drive change for children and families in Texas with the stated goal of cutting Dallas's child poverty rate in half over the coming decade. We talked last week. I'm fascinated with the way that CPAL sort of describes itself as the city's informal kind of research and development arm. And so curious about what you're learning from the data in Dallas and whether how well it sort of corresponds with some of what Phil was just sharing, and then also how you're using this data, not just to track the needs of families, but to make decisions and to drive policy changes there in Texas.
Sure. So first, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be with everyone.
we are a huge fan of the rapid survey, but also more importantly, I think the underlying philosophies for why the survey was created and also the frontline worker surveys were created, which is really trying to understand as much in real time as possible what families are facing, what frontline workers are facing, gives us the best chance to act on it, and so that we're not just using data to be a set of what I'll refer to as thermometers, just like a vehicle to admire the problem, but that we're actually, hopefully, getting to a place where the data is being applied very quickly into rapid decisions that can help meet more and more people's needs, actually work for people. I think that I'll just segment my comments into two parts. One is there's going to be a bunch of the data that you'll see in any one of these settings that is going to be wildly boring in the sense that it shouldn't surprise anybody that is coming to this call. If you're coming to this call, you probably are already involved in the issue of early development, early childhood education, or hardship or poverty related issues. It should come as no surprise to most people on this call that we don't pay our childcare workers enough, and that creates a whole host of difficulties just in their day-to-day lives, which then can transfer into their professional lives, which then transfers to the kids that they are responsible for supporting. Having said that, I think where this gets interesting is that when we can put sort of the spikes, the peaks and valleys of the data in context of what else is happening, you get actionable opportunities. So here's one that again, I think a lot of folks are going to be very familiar with. Let's look at the inverse. What's something that the data showed us that was a potential positive? And we all remember that Rapid kind of got started in the pandemic era. One of the responses to the pandemic era was the expansion of the child tax credit, where we were just putting a lot of resources into the homes of families with children. But we did something, a lot of people look at eligibility and sort of the dollar amount. We did something really novel, which is we took all the friction out of the system. We just put money in people's bank accounts, right? And an amazing thing, I'm not suggesting that a pandemic is a good strategy. We should not try to create pandemics. However, from the pandemic, it is interesting that we actually saw lots of when parents stay home with their kids and are interacting with their kids, when folks aren't as worried about whether or not they can pay for the cost of food, when there are supports to help with things like rent, like a lot of good things happen also. I mean, a lot of good things that we can learn from. Meanwhile, we get out of the pandemic and we get into a time period like now. And, while a lot of the conversation is about eligibility and whatnot, what we need to get back to is what is the experience of now even having to go and get these resources? And you can start to look at these peaks and valleys in the data and actually connect them with what families, what frontline workers are having to go through just to get at the same level of resources that we were giving them when we were in a national crisis or a shared national crisis. I would say most of the families we're talking about continue to be in a national crisis right now. So we think the more that you can organize data in a way that is connected to experience, and look at those experiences as, with the same level of rigor that, quite frankly, other industries do. And it's not just, I don't mean just an anecdote. I don't mean being flippant about it. I don't mean that we're doing this just from a value side. I mean, literally trying to code experiences into actionable data. It would be helpful. And the data that is most often, I think, missing from the system is customer service information. So we know families are struggling to find childcare, and a lot of the policy debate still focuses on how many childcare slots we have, or how much we're willing to pay for that, or even ratio, and a whole bunch of other things. I think it's as important to think about what is the experience families are having when they're on the wait list in communities across the country. There are things we can do with the resources today in program optimization if we are coding a lot of the types of experiences that Phil and his team are helping us get at, if we translate those into continued program improvement, and it has this added effect of of being able to show that we're doing a lot with a little, but that we also need more. It's a lot easier to get policymakers to give you more resources when they see a new improvement and see you reacting to what's on the ground, and when they realize that you are closer to their constituents than they are. I think the ultimate frustration for a lot of us that do this work, and frankly, the ultimate frustration, even more importantly, for families and kids who are living these numbers, is that there is very little that's more frustrating than feeling like you're closest to the data and furthest from the decision making. So that's what these tools are trying to bridge the gap on.
Alan, I've been fascinated since we talked last about this idea of sort of an improved customer service process. And I'm wondering, I can share one example that I'm familiar with in my home state of South Carolina. My former colleagues at South Carolina First Steps to School Readiness have worked across state government. We are a state where services for children and families are not unified under a single state agency, and so they're arguably a little fragmented, but they have come together with an online tool called First Five South Carolina that um, you know. Uh, Whereas once, I think, if you were a family who maybe would benefit from services, first you had to know that those services existed. And second, you had to, potentially navigate applying for those services across multiple different state agencies, each with their own, unique application process, and maybe in some cases duplicative application processes. South Carolina, I think, has done an amazing job of pulling that together now, sort of under a virtual roof where families can go in, they enter they share their zip code, they share, kind of roughly what their family income is, and this tool connects them then to all of these services through increasingly a common application, for example. Is that sort of the model that you're thinking of, or are there other state or community level examples that you would point to of really improved customer service for families?
I think I'm suggesting a state of radical pragmatism. Okay, like you said this word, like the tool that you just talked about was, could we put a lot of stuff under one roof? Let me tell you about roofs for a second. I once, a couple years ago, on an online form, asked for help on a roof inspection for my own home. I cannot get roof inspectors to ever leave me alone again. Okay, they are proactively reaching out to me all the time to say, "Do you need any help with your roof?" Why? Because that particular industry recognizes that me as the customer, I'm also the same person that gives them money. Okay. Our problem is that we're not proactive about providing services to families because the end customer here is a different person. The low income families are different than who is giving us money. It's the policymakers, it's the philanthropists, that's where the dollars are. And so we're rotating all of our time and attention to serve the dollars instead of thinking about the type of customer service data that would help us make sure that we're proactively figuring out, do you, the family, even know about this particular service? And it's not about having everything always all in one place and putting the onus on families to go to that place. It's about the right service at the right time for the right family, presented to them in a way that is relevant so that they can take advantage of it. And that is not an easy challenge, but it is a challenge that we have some of the best minds in the country working on in the consumer product space. And when it is something significantly more consequential, like basic economic security, like helping families avoid economic hardship, we're just assuming that if we pass good policy, that the ground conditions will match our intentions, and that rarely happens.
Really well said. Want to remind everyone, if you have questions for the panel, in a few minutes we'll turn to your questions. Drop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there on the Zoom toolbar. And Summer, I want to turn to you. You know, I always strive in these conversations. It's interesting to hear from Phil's perspective, for example, sort of the results at the national level as we're gathering data from families all across the country. But you know, I think it's important in all of these conversations to get as close to families as we can, to really include the perspective of kind of the, you know, the boots on the ground, if you will. And you are involved in just that, working directly with the families in Onondaga County, which for those of you who may not be familiar is the area right around Syracuse, New York. Talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing right now with the families that you're working with. Do these themes that Phil and Alan have brought up sort of resonate with you in terms of the, you know, the needs that you're seeing of the families there in Syracuse?
Hi, thank you, Dan, Alan, and Phil. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation. So yeah, I do work in Onondaga County, and that puts us in direct daily contact with families that are navigating these hardships. And so yes, to speak to what Phil and Alan spoke about, we are definitely experiencing the same things on the ground. Families are basically telling us that they're overwhelmed, not just by economic stress, but by emotional and logistical strains that they're having to deal with on a daily basis. So access to things like basic needs like diapers, formula, transportation, and childcare, those continue to be things that we struggle with in our county and figuring out ways to support families. So we're using this kind of real-time feedback to really figure out what families need and how can we support them and be kind of in alliance with them and making sure that their customer service needs that they have are being met and that we're really doing it in a way that works, that's beneficial to them and not to us as an agency.
That's great, and I know you're doing some really innovative things with families, sort of matching technologies, for example, things like DoorDash, for example, with the needs of families. Fill us in a little bit about how that's making a difference there.
Yeah, so I want to say I have to thank our county. How we have it set up, we have a 211 call line. So if everyone doesn't know, it's really with families. It's kind of like 911, but 211 is for social service needs where families can call 211 and they get connected to a wide range of services. And the part of the work that we do here, what helped me grow, is when families have children between the ages of 0 to 5, we can really work with them to connect them to local supports and services, but really with that customer service background where we're knowing who we're connecting them to and how does it work and how they can be like answering any of their questions, but really making sure that they're connected. So, but one of the things that we realized from the data was that in our community, transportation can be very hard, but also you can have the services in place, but they just may not be enough. So what we were able to do is really talk to our funders and really use the data to speak to the fact that we have families that are connected to WIC, but WIC is a supplement. It does not last all month. So when they're experiencing those financial strains, what happens then is that they have to make hard decisions between, do they buy formula? Do they buy food for the rest of the families? So what we were able to do here, and also even diapering, like we know diapers, babies need diapers. You have 1 week, your baby gets sick, you go from 10 diapers to 20 diapers in a day, and now you have to kind of buy extra diapers. So what we do here is we work with the Central New York Diaper Bank, one, to give families free access to diapers. And we actually have formula here that we can give out to families completely for free. We know that they're connected to WIC, but we want to make sure that they have those needs to meet the basic needs. So what happens is that families can call us. We know that transportation is hard, so we actually use this really unique program. It's through our partnership with United Way. It's called Project Dash, where we can DoorDash. So we use DoorDash drivers to come pick the items up from our office in Syracuse, and we can deliver all throughout the county. So families really don't, if they don't have money to get on the bus, just trying to balance out, trying to get kids on the bus, the hours of when the places are in service, we can DoorDash it to them directly to their doorsteps. So it kind of alleviates that, how am I going to get it? What are we going to do to get there? And that has been extremely helpful for families. It actually started a little bit right during COVID. We started using this, and it's been something that we don't have enough staff to get to families, but we do have drivers. So it actually employs the DoorDash drivers in our community. And it's one of the best things that families are saying, that I know this resource exists, but I just couldn't get there. So we're like, we're going to bring it directly to your doorstep. And it's been really helpful for us to get the basic need items to families. And then there's one less thing that they have to worry about. It allows them to think about the other things like the rent, and especially financially, like being able to feed your kid is a big key piece. And so I'm getting happy and smiling because it's one of my favorite pieces of the work that we do. And we do it like I think in a month, we're averaging almost 500 deliveries per month for basic need items. And we even have been able to partner with our local food bank so they have access to it, and really thinking of unique ways to just meet families' needs.
And Semper, I don't want to put you on the spot necessarily, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, but just the sort of the connection between the data that Phil was sharing at the beginning of the hour and these families in need that you're working with. Have you seen in practice over the past couple of months evidence of that, that dramatic spike that the rapid survey is showing? Are you hearing from families that things are becoming worse in real time?
Yes, we definitely are hearing that. Like I said, in a given day, we're fielding I think there was a time where it got down to 10 calls a day. Now we're back up in the 20s of phone calls of families just saying, I need help. I need diapers. What I'm getting is not enough. I don't have the financial means for it. So we're definitely seeing that increase, and we are trying to prepare here internally to meet that need, and making sure. And I will tell you, even now, we're door dashing. We have DoorDash, but we're also using other services where we can just send it directly from the store to the families to meet those needs, because it's definitely evident every day.
That's great.
Dan, if I may, I
Please.
wanted to comment on Summer's description of this amazing program. When we were initially collecting data during the pandemic about hunger and food insecurity, one of the things that we heard regularly from families when we asked open-ended questions about how they were dealing with these kinds of issues was very aligned with kind of the solution that you've come up with, Summer, in that we heard a lot of families saying, in my community, I know there's a food bank, but I can't get to it. I'm an essential worker. I gotta leave my kids at home and then go right back home afterwards, or I can't get all my kids on the bus. I don't feel safe. I have elderly family members at home. I don't want them to be exposed. And so we very much heard that what oftentimes I think, people might think, oh, these needs for food, for getting food are met in our community because we have food banks available. What families were telling us was that those were not sufficiently designed around, as we've been talking about, around customer service. And so just putting something out there and saying, here's a resource doesn't necessarily deal with the issue that's needing attention. Whereas if you really listen to what people are telling you, then you can design around what people really do need and meet the needs much more effectively. So I think this is a really powerful example of how the community has responded, not just by saying, hey, we've got food or we've got diapers or formula if people need it, but getting it to people who can't otherwise access it.
Phil, I think that's a really important point, and probably important to say that a lot of these family resources, food banks, for example, tend to be volunteer missions of local churches, for example. That they may be available to a certain extent, but may also be available on a very limited basis in practice, right? That maybe they're only open for 4 hours a week or something like that. And so, I had a fascinating experience I related in this book that I released last year about a preschool in Kansas where the director explained that maybe her biggest need was to have a floating substitute teacher so that her teachers could get to the bank. And I, immediately thought that she was talking about like a financial bank, but in fact, what she was talking about was, that this, that because of their pay, that they were unable to put food on the table for their families, but that, the only available resource in the community was open for a very limited period, and so that she worked to arrange their schedules each week in a way that they could leave the school and make it to a food bank. So I think summer really highlights this issue of, even when we perceive services to be available, they may not be, super readily accessible to the families that need them most. Well, with that, we've got a little while. I want to, before we turn to questions from the audience, want to take a moment to think through this data. And Alan, maybe you're a good one to start with here, and Phil, you probably have examples from around the country too. But Alan, back to this question of you being kind of the R&D arm for the city of Dallas. Are there practical examples that you would uplift around how having this data, having the child tax credit data, for example, or some other set of data, has enabled you to go and work with policymakers and really drive positive change?
Well, sure. You can start to apply data in a whole variety of ways. So why don't I talk through just a couple ways that data can actually just practically be used in your communities. One is to look for places not where the experience of the lowest income families are actually different than the experiences of other income strata, but actually where there's a pain point or experience alignment, and thereby an incentive alignment to sort of build a big tent for change. So we're talking a lot about material hardship or economic hardship. There's another sort of link a couple steps above that, which is economic security. And there's a lot of folks that are struggling to reach economic security for a lot of the same reasons that families that we're surveying are having economic hardship. The cost of housing has been rising at a dramatic rate, and not just for any one income strata. That creates an opportunity, sort of a shared experience, and therefore a movement opportunity to try to solve for housing costs. And it creates great advocacy from those with different networks of influence within your local community. So I'd be looking for places where there's shared experience. I'd also be looking for places where there's shared experience from the dimension of empathy. So, I always talk about how I think, some of the first work that I was sharing with Phil that was coming out of Dallas, our first project was looking at the Women, Infants, and Children Nutrition Program. And us seeing that it was taking mom on average 4 hours from the time that she showed up at a WIC clinic till she was able to actually receive her benefits. Here's the cool thing: even if you are not on WIC, nobody wants to defend the experience of the DMV. And so that creates a great shared empathy idea to try to problem solve. And then the last is to really start to look at true economic incentive alignment between the system. And so I think there's a lot of work that you can do with data to back into, we understand what problem we're trying to solve, and then back into where there are opportunities to create savings not only for families, but also for the system at large in a way that breaks us out of zero-sum thinking. So, for example, we now look at utility records in Dallas, so utility bills. We mine utility bills. This creates an early warning system for who is going to have a housing insecurity issue, who is likely to be evicted if we don't intervene. That allows us to proactively reach out to them and create supports. If you then start to look at the rate of those that are evicted in terms of their need to access homeless services or ER services, you start to realize there's a huge economic cost to your cities, your counties, and the overall state government infrastructure to not prevent an eviction. If you build a financial model on that end, you start to break out of zero sum and start to realize that funding the upfront early intervention and using data to identify where you can insert that early intervention, where you can proactively outreach, you can actually save people money on the back end. This breaks through a whole bunch of ideological problems. I got those in Texas that are ideologically all about government saving and government spending less money. I got all of those that are ideologically on a different bend that are looking for government to expand and spend more money on programs. I'd like us to say that there are certain places where we can spend money and save money at the same time, and I can show that to you by combining the practical, like practical data that's happening in real time through the programs, with also the benefit not only to economics, but also to real people's experience by taking the type of data that Phil, that Summer, that others are using to frame issues.
Now, say a little bit more about this question on the utility bills. Is the idea that you're able to track maybe who's falling behind on their payment, or what? How is that
Yeah.
particular data able to tell a story, and what are you doing for those families as you identify them?
So there's a whole host of different things that we do on the eviction prevention space, but we are able to build a statistical model that shows the likelihood of an eviction being filed against a tenant. And we have found that there is an actual statistically significant correlation, like a very clear correlation between falling behind on utility bills, particularly when we are able to layer in some other information and who is likely to have an eviction filed against them. That lets us outreach early and make sure that folks are aware of supports like pro bono legal counsel. We also find through doing court observations, or what I love to refer to as the advanced strategy of counting stuff, that tenants that have a lawyer when they show up for their eviction hearing win at a rate of about 7 times the rate of a tenant that shows up without an attorney, because a lot of the evictions that are filed are not filed using all fair housing laws. Landlords have come to realize that there are a lot of times if they just file an eviction, tenants will not have the legal representation. And so what we're not against is the idea of eviction overall. I mean, that's necessary for landlords to run, but we are against unlawful evictions. And we do feel like there's a shared social contract priority within Dallas to try to make sure children have stable homes and roofs over their head. So we're trying to find ways that we can use data that can help us prevent a bad outcome for kids, save money for the system, and sort of enhance the social contract versus enhance ideological divisions.
That's fascinating. Summer, I wanted to ask you, when we spoke last week, you were sharing a little bit about some data that you had collected, I think internally, if I understood correctly, about the percentage of your families who had at least one indicator or symptom of emotional distress, and that number was particularly high. You want to tell us a little bit about that and what you're doing as a result of that data?
Yeah, so when we did some of our surveys, we realized that 78% of parents were reporting that they had at least one emotional distress symptom, so like anxiety, depression, or persistent loneliness, which is really a high number. We were kind of shocked to see it, but what we have been doing all along with that, and it's not just parents, I would say it's caregivers, grandparents, anyone who's really like a provider for young children. We have been working internally. We have a PAC, so a Parent Advisory Council, and they created a program called Thriving, Not Just Surviving, as a parent support group. And their whole goal is to be able to check in with the families and provide support around things that they deem are important. So we're really taking the lead from them. And what we're hoping to do is by just doing that check-in, saying like, how can we help you? What are your needs? Really getting back to them and what they want, letting them lead the work, that has been really helpful for them. And so our PAC, they help us structure how we do the work here in our county and really getting their voice, not just in our work, like in our agency, but also local other community agencies, has been really important. So I think our Thriving group is really being there just to support one another and building up those relationships amongst each other, because sometimes, it's hard when you have to do it alone, but when you find someone that you can do the work with you and just maybe, hey, I need to babysit, I have to do something. Can you watch my kid for a few hours? I can watch yours, or like, let's just meet up at the park together. So really creating those environments where they can just be with each other.
That's great. Phil, I wanted to ask you too. We've talked about the rapid survey in its national context, right? But I know that, increasingly you and the team at Stanford are working with states and other, community kind of localities to maybe to drill down or to personalize the rapid survey to their particular context. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about maybe what do you see as the benefit of that for one? How are communities benefiting from that? And how might, if somebody in the viewing audience is watching, if policymakers are involved and think this would be a useful data set for them, how might they get involved?
Thank you for asking that, Dan. I think the it's absolutely the case that there has been a lot of interest in going beyond the national data, and in fact, been incoming interest. Alan was one of the early adopters and his team of this. But when the rapid data started to kind of go out at the national level, we started to hear from communities, from counties, from states, saying these data are really interesting, but we want to know about our population in a more granular way. And so, in response to that demand, we really started to ratchet up our capacity to do local and state-based surveys. And we've done a number now in communities and counties around the country, as well as in 5 states: California, Connecticut, Vermont, uh, Ohio, and Hawaii. And more communities and states are kind of in the queue. And we think this is really important because it really is the local data that gets the attention of people who can make decisions about allocation of resources. It's also extremely important for families themselves and the workforce to know that their voices are being heard at a local level. So we have lots of great impact stories. Perhaps one of the most recent exciting ones is that the rapid data in the state of Connecticut was used as part of the advocacy to pass a bill that made childcare either free for low-income people or much more affordable, not above 7% of people's annual income for people of middle and upper income levels. And so those kinds of data are really, really critical. And as I've mentioned, it's not just the numeric data. I think one of the things that both Alan and Summer have alluded to is that it's really using data for storytelling. And so being able to not only say this proportion of families are struggling, but to say, here are their voices. These are the things that people are telling us about, as we've seen in the comments, about sacrifices that people are having to make in order to make ends meet. Those things are really compelling and powerful. So
Yeah,
go
Alan,
ahead.
it makes perfect sense. But I guess since Phil mentioned you as an early adopter, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that about what having a localized version of Rapid has meant for your community.
Well, look, we believe really strongly in, again, kind of the underlying principles of this work. We were very excited to start to see rapid data being integrated into folks' understandings of what was happening in the pandemic, and actually doing that, and not just from sort of like a big, like, here's the issue for the United States, but actually here is the issue for a family in your community. That was exciting, but also just being like very honest, like uh, the fact that the Stanford Center on Early Childhood was willing to stamp that brand on this type of approach is a really big deal as a validator. There's a lot of folks that aren't going to just listen to the community nonprofit that we need to be part of the solutions. But when the Stanford Center on Early Childhood is also saying that this is an important thing to be listening to, that matters. So what I think Phil is doing is a clarion call for the academic world. So we have this problem. It's a tension between the academic world and frankly the kind of like venture philanthropy world. In the academic world, like all the incentives are towards what I'll refer to as standard of evidence, right? Like I need to be able to prove out my study because I need to be able to defend my dissertation. And if I defend my dissertation, I get a cool title. And I need to get published on stuff and like have all my colleagues be able to ask me questions and be able to like stand up to that. And if I do that, I can get tenure. Like all the incentives are just standard of evidence. It doesn't actually ever have to help a single party. It doesn't ever have to be adopted by a single person. Venture philanthropy is almost the opposite, right? A lot of the folks that are the largest funders of philanthropic programs come out of different industries, and they just want to see lots of adoption. If I can show you that 20,000 families are using my program or 200,000 families are using my program, then I'm just going to assume that it's a good thing. Why? Because in my other businesses, adoption and sales were tied together, and sales was the ultimate standard of success. What we need is enough adoption of programming and experiences that have enough evidence to suggest that it's going to change the lives and trajectories of families and children. And a lot of times we've been putting all of the onus on community organizations and nonprofits to go out and prove that you're aligning to the evidence. We also need researchers and those with academic credentials to actually be concerned about how their work can actually drive into adoption as well. And I think that's a clarion call that's being led by Phil and his team.
Phil, we've got some questions I want to jump to from the audience too, but I just want to quickly acknowledge, as I did in the opening, we had by my last count, not only a sizable U.S. audience registered today, but I think 13 other countries. Has Stanford given any thought, or have you had contact around the idea of taking this outside of the U.S., and/or are you aware of international organizations that are maybe doing similar work?
Yeah, there's a version of the rapid survey in Peru that started early on during the pandemic. We sort of did a little bit of technical assistance, and then it was off to the races, and it's been ongoing. In addition, we're partnering with a university, Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, that has an early childhood center that's interested in doing a version of rapid there as well. And we think that there's a lot of potential. I mean, as Alan was saying, there's really kind of no limit on the importance of getting this kind of actionable data and the voices of adults in the lives of young children out and into the hands of people who are interested in it and reflecting it back to those who are providing it. It really is a different approach to what we think about in terms of what research can do. And research really should be a tool for empowerment and for self-determination. We know that that data is an incredibly valuable commodity and communities value it. And at the same time, it should not be the purview of academic institutions only to be able to access and make use of it. And so this is really an effort to shift how we think about collecting information and making it valuable. And for sure, we have lots of interest in continuing to expand both within the U.S. in these local and state surveys, as well as in national surveys and local ones in other places. I will say, I just want to make one quick comment that we think that because of what's happening at the federal level, that state-based data is especially critical in meeting this moment, because so much of what's going to be happening is going to be policy that's made and funding that's made available or not made available on a state by state basis. And so, you can think about what I mentioned in Connecticut and the idea that if you could actually get affordable childcare in Connecticut, maybe that would make it a desirable place to live if you had young children. And so we really see a lot of what will be unfolding in this country in the near future as being determined at a state level, and really, really critical to be gathering that information.
That's
I
great.
just want to jump in on one because I just think this is a moment, which is the more everybody on this call can continue to tell the stories of what is actually happening in people's lives, the practical implications of some of the decisions, some of the changes to federal policy, and it makes a huge difference. We just saw AmeriCorps come back online this week. Okay. That only happens because people are picking up the phone and calling and letting those that are in decision authority over federal programs know that this is actually having a real effect on the ground. That just does not happen without experience level data being integrated into the conversation.
Oh, thanks. And I'm noticing both in the chat and in the Q&A, we've got multiple different questions about Phil, how to get involved, what is the cost of the survey, that sort of thing. I think we've got about 4 minutes to the top of the hour, probably not an easy topic to unpack, but I do want to flag for you all if you scroll upward in the chat just a bit that Phil has included the name and email address for Christy Carmen, who is the director of the Rapid Survey at Stanford, and she would be a great resource if you want to reach out to get connected. Christy's email is right there in the chat, and you can pull that up. Want to take just a couple of minutes here and make sure we get into some of these questions. Summer, first question here. I think a lot of people I noticed in the chat and also now in the Q&A are really fascinated by this DoorDash example that you've been using in Syracuse. How did that come about, and how might others get involved? I think it seems to me like maybe Benita's question in the chat here mirrored my fascination with like, wow, that's a really good idea. How did you get to a place that you were able to connect through DoorDash?
So we were able to connect through DoorDash through our local United Way. I will share that we are actually moving off and starting doing it on our own, just so the United Way can bring in another community partner because we do have the infrastructure to manage ourselves. But you can reach out to DoorDash directly, and it is an option for any local nonprofit to kind of do. And I will share too, one thing on top of DoorDash, if you have families that have issues with transportation, Lyft also has a program where you can do Lyft services to this to help address some of the transportation barriers as well. And they're just open. I think it's like Lyft business account, and they're open to nonprofits. The rates do vary based on how many orders you send out. And for Lyft, I think it's like your radius. So you can do like a 10-mile radius or a 15-mile radius, and they're about $4.50 to $5.50 per order.
Great. Bill, I threw out the challenge earlier in the hour. If people in the viewing audience had ideas on what might be behind that spike, so I want to acknowledge Alicia had raised the question of could that jump in June one be due to at least the increased threat of deportation and families' concerns around even kind of leaving home to work potentially in some low-income communities. The other idea that she posed that I thought was fascinating and also made some sense was, could children being at home for summer break increase families' food needs in ways that that maybe during the school year aren't as big a challenge because the schools are providing that meal support.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all very viable potential explanations. One of the nice things about a survey that goes out on a monthly basis is that when we find information, quantitative information like this, that's the what. We can then begin to dig into why.
Into
And
what?
so I think part of the question is, was this just an anomaly? But even if it is, still 40% of households is not an acceptable number of families that can't afford basic needs, let alone the rates for the workforce. But we will be investigating this with data that we're now collecting, and we'll be posting on it. So I would say stay tuned. There have been lots of potential explanations offered. What I will say is that I think, most of our advisors on these kinds of topics have said that we won't really begin to see some of the impacts of the policies until fall and into winter, just because they've been sort of slow to take effect. And so the fact that we see this increase now, begs the question of what will happen as we move into the fall and winter months, and whether the rates continue to climb and how we see the families' distress levels kind of going along with those things. So stay tuned.
We are right at the top of the hour. I want to throw in, there's one last question I'll let any or all of you sort of weigh in on here. But someone is asking, in your opinion, what are the actionable steps that everyone who is watching can take in their local community to help to lower some of those trends, Phil, that we were looking at? Other than putting the burden on policymakers who may or may not always be responsive. I would think, Alan, to your point earlier, and I've certainly seen this throughout my career in policy too. I want to put in a word for just how important it is. You just said keep telling your story, and having that data available. I mean, I think I can think to so many examples throughout my career of policy change that may well not have happened or may not have happened as rapidly as it did, were it not for really compelling data and stories around it. So I don't know if anybody wants to weigh in on that. What can we all do next? Question.
I'll give it a super quick, which is I think you should focus on impact at scale by focusing on not scale. Go have a single conversation with a single person that's just struggling to try to figure out how to provide for their family and try to problem solve with them. And I promise it's going to be a flashlight to all sorts of different things that are broken that could have broader implications for other folks. But just go talk to somebody.
That's great. That may be a great place for us to wrap it up. I want to honor the time commitment that our panel has made, but also that all of you have made. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to participate in this conversation. I want to thank Phil Fisher, Faculty Director of the Stanford Center on Early Childhood, Summer Merrick, Director of Help Me Grow of Onondaga County, New York, and Alan Cohen, Founder and CEO of CPAL, the Child Poverty Action Lab in Dallas, Texas. Great to be with you all. Want to remind you all, we've dropped it in the chat a couple of times. We'll be back on August 15th, a great conversation around sort of both the promise and the potential perils of AI in education, with a fantastic panel of experts coming up August 15th. So we hope we'll see you back in a couple of weeks, and wish you all a great afternoon wherever it is you're watching from around the world. Thanks, everyone.